King George was a fighting man, like his father, head of the army, and very much engaged in the quarrels between the rulers of continental Europe. Walpole tried hard to keep him out of wars, but in 1739 the king got his way and England went to war with Spain. This was the start of a steadily growing involvement in the power struggle between France, Prussia and the Habsburg Empire. Its culmination for George came in June 1743. He found himself under attack by the French at a German village called Dettingen. His horse bolted, but George stood in front of his troops, waved his sword and made a rather ponderous but actually rather brave little speech.
Now, boys, now for the honor of England. Fire and behave bravely, or the French will soon run.
And so he became the last English king to lead his troops in battle. It was a fierce fight, and George emerged a bit of a hero. But he didn't rule the country. Governments and ministers came and went not because he wanted them, but because Parliament wanted them. In fact, George called himself a prisoner on the throne. In 1745, he played no part in the battles of Prestonpans or Culloden, which were far more important to the throne than the Battle of Dettingen. After all, they were battles for the throne itself. Bonnie Prince Charlie to his supporters, Charles Casimir was 25 years old, pale, thin, romantic and brave. And he decided that George was so unpopular it would be a doddle to take over. He turned up at his own expense in the Hebrides and summoned the Scottish clans. Most of them responded, but out of a combination of loyalty and desperation rather than conviction. But things went rather well for the rebels. They were enthusiastically welcomed into Edinburgh and roundly defeated the government army at Prestonpans. The news created a passion of patriotism when it reached London. The city might have lampooned the court and sneered at it, but this was different. That evening the king was visiting the theatre, the King's Theatre, Drury Lane, and the orchestra struck up a tune which they'd just got hold of.
God save a gracious king, long live a noble king, God save the king.
The audience loved it. None of them knew that it had been the Old Pretenders' music, or the King of France's. The song had changed sides and became the national anthem. Actually, it became everybody's anthem at one time or another. Frenchmen, Germans, Russians, Swiss, Liechtensteiners, Swedes, Danes and Americans have all swelled with patriotic pride to exactly the same tune. But when God Save the King became London's big hit, it was because no one could see how the king would be saved any other way. Marshal Wade, the best officer in the government army, said that Scotland was lost and England would fall prey to the first comer.
Lord, grant that Marshal Wade may by thy mighty aid victory bring. May he sedition hush, and like a torrent rush, rebellious Scots to crush. God save the King.
The rebels took Manchester, then Derby. London trembled, but not as much as the clansmen. They'd marched expecting England to rise in their support and the French to invade. Instead, they had no support at all. Most fundamentally, they realized that the English would never accept a Roman Catholic king. They'd outflanked a large English army, but it was now on their tail, and another was coming up from London. So back they went, and the clansmen were finally slaughtered in their thousands at Culloden in April 1746. Charles hid out for months in the Scottish Islands, hunted through the mountains by troops and with a price on his head, but protected by tribal loyalties until he finally escaped back to France. And the clan culture of the Highlands was systematically and ruthlessly extirpated. Clans were dispersed, their leaders imprisoned or executed, plaid and weaponry and bagpipes were banned. The would-be Charles III made a bizarre secret return to England in 1750,
where he converted to Protestantism and expected this would encourage his supporters to have more hope. They were more impressed by his degree of attachment to the bottle, not so much the king over the water as the king under the table. King George was in no danger now. George also found his other great enemy removed. His son Frederick died in 1751. He'd been hit hard in the stomach by a tennis ball, and the resulting abdominal ulcer burst and killed him. The new heir to the throne was a 12-year-old child, Frederick's son, George. But the great problems of the kingdom were outside the king's grasp. His country was now a great imperial trading power, with huge involvements in India, the East Indies, North America, and the Mediterranean. So was France. At the same time, continental Europe was constantly boiling over into war, and Hanover was in the middle of that. In 1756, the great powers finally locked horns in a do-or-die struggle that would girdle the whole world. This would become the 7 Years' War. It was truly the First World War. Britain fought in the name of its king, but that king now neither directed policy nor took part in the battles. A new world.
In fact, affairs were so far out of the king's control that when he dismissed ministers he didn't like, they came right back again. So far as the English were concerned, this was just how things ought to be. Englishmen were entitled to liberty. The despots were on the other side, Catholic France and Austria. Their whole life, commerce, industry, and fighting force was directed by royal tyrants who ruled over starving and powerless peasants. And on the other side, Protestant Britain, whose commerce was run by men of business, whose industry was directed by free tradesmen, whose army and navy were run by heroes and manned by proud free men, and whose court was the centre of society, not of autocratic power. And that was how many of the British really did see it. Of course, they were also fighting on the side of despotic Prussia, but that was a minor detail.
The general perception was that this was a war of free Britons against European despots. Poor George died at the height of the war in 1760, and it didn't matter at all.